make the easy crisscross cowl, begin by counting 20 loops. Place the loops on a flat surface and make sure all your loops are pointing up. That's going to make it easier to work your first row. So to make a plain stitch, I would be working one loop to one loop all the way across as we see the loops. To make this crisscross stitch, I'm going to cross the stitches before I work them. So let me show you how. I'm going to take my 20th loop, cross it in front of that 19th loop, and I'm making a pair of cross stitches. I'm going to pinch it at the base, then I'm going to take the first loop from my working yarn, bring it behind that first stitch, and pull it up and through, and just let it go. Then I'm going to take the next stitch from my working yarn. The working yarn is the yarn that's attached to your ball. Bring it behind the cross stitches and up and through that second crossed stitch. So now I've worked 2 stitches. I'm going to keep going all the way across, working in pairs. So I'm taking my next 2 stitches, I'm crossing the one on the right over the one on the left in front. Taking the next loop from my working yarn, bringing it behind that first stitch and up and through. The next loop from your working yarn, from behind and up and through. So you're always pulling the loops from the back to the front. So now I have 4 worked stitches and 2 crosses. And I'm going to keep going all the way across those 20 loops. Okay, I've worked all 20 loops of my first row, and it's going to look a little messy. So take some time to straighten things out, give the loops a little tug, get them all pointing upwards again. It just makes it easier to figure out what stitch you have to work next for your next row. So that was row 1. We're going to begin row 2. And we're going to be working back in the other direction. So you never turn your work like traditional knitting. The right side is always facing. That first row we worked right to left. Now I'm going to work left to right. So the other trick is on our second row, you're not going to work the first stitch. So don't work this one. Cross the next pair of stitches. So I'm taking the second stitch over the third stitch in the front, crossing it over the front, from left to right. So previously on the first row, we were working, crossing our stitches crossing the loops from right to left. Now I'm crossing the loops from left to right. It's also the direction we're working, which makes it easier to remember. So again, for row 2, I'm going to take my next pair of stitches, cross the one on the left in front of the one on the right, so it's leaning over to the right. Take the next loop from my working yarn, pull it up and through from the back to the front, and same with the next stitch in my pair. And you do that all the way across until the last stitch. At the end of the second row, once you've crossed your last pair, you're going to be left with 1 stitch. So don't work the first loop of the second row, and when you get to the end, don't work the last loop of the second row. And again, just take a moment to straighten out your loops. Make sure they're all pointing up. And now I'm going to work the third row. So the third row, we're going back the other way. We're going to work from right to left. I'm going to take that unworked stitch from my previous row, the second row, cross it over the next stitch. So I'm crossing it in the front from right to left. Then I'm going to take my next loop from my working yarn, bring it up through the first stitch, just like we did before, and bring it through the next stitch. And work all the way across, this time crossing your loop from right to left in front of the next stitch. Next loop from the working yarn, from the back, up and through. My next pair of stitches, cross the one on the right, over the one on the left, in the front, pinch them at the base to hold them in place as you work, and bring the loops through from back to front. So this time we're working every stitch in the row. You don't skip anything. I am at the end of my third row. Again, I'm going to take a moment just to get everything nice and neat. And those are the only rows you need to know for the whole crisscross pattern. You're going to repeat the second and third row over and over. You can't quite see the pattern yet, but I'll work a couple more rows. So now this is the fourth row that I've worked, but I'm repeating the second row. You do the second and third row over and over. So the instructions on the second row have you skip the first stitch, skip the last stitch. I'm going to take that second stitch, cross it in front of the next stitch, working from left to right, always crossing in front and crossing in the same direction that you're working. So my stitch is leaning over to the right because that's the direction I'm heading. And always bring your loop from the working yarn from the back to the front. At the end of this row, I'm leaving that last stitch uncrossed, and I'm just going to smooth things out a little bit to make it easier before I begin my next row. And that's, again, repeating the third row. I just worked the second row instructions, and now I'm repeating the third row. So I'm going to take that stitch that I didn't work at the end of the last row. I'm going to cross it over the next stitch, in front, and this time I'm working from right to left. Pull the next stitch from the working yarn, from the back to the front, through the first of your cross stitches, and then the second one, and work all the way across. In this row, you work every single stitch. I've just completed a third row again, and you can start to see the lattice stitch forming, the crisscross pattern. And just keep repeating that second and third row. For a cowl, you're going to need to work about 26 inches or 66.5 centimeters. After you've worked 26 inches of your crisscross stitch, end on a second row, and then you're going to want to work a bind-off row to secure all of these loops so they don't unravel. So on a second row, you've worked from left to right, and that's the same direction you're going to work your bind-off row. So to bind off your stitches, you're going to take the first loop of your row and pass the second loop through that first loop. Or I like to think of it as taking the loop. I'm just going to undo that and show you again. Passing the first loop over the second loop. Now you've bound off one stitch. And then do that all the way across the row. So I'm taking this loop that I have here on the left, passing it over the one on the right. Take this loop that I was just working with, the one on the left, and pass it over the one on the right. And you can see as I go, I'm losing a stitch each time, and it creates this nice ridge. and your loops aren't going to come undone. When you get to the end of the row and you've bound off your last stitch, you'll have one loop left. Just leave that loop, and then also leave yourself approximately 22 loops, that's 2 loops more than we began with, to work your seam to turn this into a cowl. Once you've finished your bind off row, you're going to want to seam the first row to the last row to form a tube to form your cowl. So here I have the work folded in half, and the wrong side is facing me. This is the right side. The right sides are facing each other, and you can tell it's the right side because you can see the crisscross pattern. So line up the edges, and then find that last loop from your bind off row and pull that up through the fabric at the front. Then I'm going to take the next loop from my working yarn, and I'm going to pull it up through both thicknesses. So I'm bringing it through the back and the front. It doesn't really matter exactly where you poke it. Then I'm going to bind off these 2 stitches. So just like we did before, I'm going to pull this loop over the one on the left. And then continue working in this way. So I'm going to take the next loop from my working yarn. I'm going to pull it up through the fabric in the back and the front. And then I'm going to bind off the stitch. So I'm pulling the loop on the right over the one on the left. Over. Then I'm taking my next loop from the working yarn. And this time I'll pull it through both thicknesses at the same time. Then I'm going to bind off these stitches. So I'm taking the one on the right, pulling it over the one on the left. So you can see this is joining the fabric together, and you've got a little bit of a ridge there, but it's going to be on the inside of the cowl, and no one will see that. So keep going in this manner, pulling the loops from your working yarn through the both thicknesses to join them together, and then binding off your stitches. So now I'm working my last loop, pulling it through both thicknesses to seam my cowl together, binding off that last loop. Now I have one loop left to secure. So to do that, I'm going to cut the next loop from my working yarn. So if you look carefully at the yarn, you can actually cut it at the base of this loop right here, very carefully, and then this loop will come apart and you'll be left with a smooth piece of yarn. Like so. Now I'm going to cut before the next loop, and I'm going to bring that yarn tail through the last loop on my seam. So you can either thread this end through a tapestry needle with a large eye, or if you don't have one on hand, you can just poke that end through a few stitches along your seam. Just so it doesn't come loose. And you can see there's my seam, but that's on the inside of the cowl that we're not going to see. Once you turn it inside out, it's not invisible, but it's much more attractive looking. And that's it.